fields. I'm in a very research-heavy field of pathology. So I wanted to talk to you because I was kind of getting curious about what are the rules about authorship? And then how, with artificial intelligence, how are some things changing? How does industry sponsorship change some of that? So that's the impetus for this talk today. So I think all of you are probably familiar with these journal titles. I think that it's aspirational for many people, including probably many of us, to end up publishing in these journals. I had a colleague who impressively was able to publish in all of these in a couple of years' time, which was impressive. So I think we all know that a lot of prestige comes from authorship, and especially in high impact journals such as these. So how do people end up authors on papers in these illustrious journals, and how do we decide who deserves authorship? So some questions that I was thinking about that other people probably think about when they start to embark on a research journey include, should I be an author on this paper? Like what is the qualification that I need to meet in order to be an author? Who else should be an author? What order should they be in? A funny story, when I was a research assistant, there was a postdoc who was a psychiatrist in the lab. We had a neurogenetics laboratory studying bipolar disorder. And he was working on his first manuscript, his first author. And he said, Lauren, you did a lot of work, but you didn't do as much as these other people. So you're going to be last author, which I thought was pretty amusing if you understand that usually the principal investigator, the head of the lab, is the last author. So I told him, sure, I'll be last author. That sounds good to me. And then like, who decides the order? So is it the first author that decides? Is it the PI that decides the order of authors? This really does vary. It just varies depending on where you're doing your research, what the context of the research is, perhaps how many collaborators you have. Maybe you're working with a bunch of different laboratories. Nowadays, we'll talk about this a little bit later, but you can even have co-first authors. What does that mean? And like, is it really true that each author receives the same amount of credit for that paper? So for a lot of this talk, I looked into the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors because they publish a yearly update on things such as this. And it seems that a lot of journals do defer to this organization. So I'll show you a quote from Science later where they specifically have used a lot of the information that comes from these updates. Previously, it was called the Uniform Requirements for Manuscripts Submitted to Biomedical Journals, pretty simple, back in 1978. But now it's a little bit more comprehensive, and it includes recommendations for the conduct, reporting, editing, and publication. So there's a lot more information that they cover in these articles. So we all understand intuitively, I think, why authorship matters. So you want to get credit. You worked really hard. You did a lot of work on this research project. It also affords you quite a bit of academic recognition. So you might get famous for your New England Journal article. It might get you lots of invitations to give talks. It might get you recognized as a national expert. You might be the national expert after you publish this paper. Tenure and promotion are closely tied in academics to publications. So it varies in different departments, but typically most departments have a threshold for what they consider to be appropriate number of publications to reach different ranks. That's changed somewhat in that it's gotten a little bit more lenient with other types of dissemination, such as blogs and things like that. But typically, academic articles are very important, especially in the tenure process. And it also then can be tied to your salary. So you get promoted, you get more money. So some of the components that we think about in a research project where you could contribute include the conceptualization of the project. So whose idea was it? Who decided they wanted to study the, genetics of this one subtype of lymphoma? So that potentially could be the principal investigator. It could be a bunch of different people working in the laboratory. Maybe you were more involved once the project became at the forefront of the laboratory in the planning of the project. So you might have performed literature searches, you might have acquired funding, implementation of the project. So who does the data gathering? When I was a research assistant, I organized a lot of the data on our bipolar disorder project. Who does the data analysis? Do you get a biostatistician who is employed in your laboratory? Do you get outside help with that? Do you have a postdoc working on the statistics? And then the writing and editing. So very, what we sort of think about as the manuscript preparation, but all of these things go into a good research project. So the International Committee has these 4 criteria for authorship, and it's important to remember that all of them are required. So we can't just do one of them, we have to do all of them to deserve authorship. So the first thing that they mention is a substantial contribution in some area that we've discussed already. So the design of the project, the data collection for the project, maybe it would be the analysis. There needs to be some what, subjectively could be termed substantial contribution in order to meet criteria for authorship. Number 2, everyone has to be involved with drafting the paper or critical review. So we often think of the first author as being the person who writes the draft of the paper. That definitely can vary, especially having been on both sides of that now, how motivated the first author is to complete the first draft. But we often think of the first author doing that and the last author revising it. But really, it's a process where everybody should be involved in some way in drafting and or reviewing this manuscript. So that's number 2. Number 3, everyone must provide final review of the manuscript. So everybody needs to read the paper and approve it. And I think most people obviously try to follow this rule. I can tell you that in my research career, there have been times that this did not happen because recently I found a paper from my laboratory that I worked in the 90s that I didn't even know existed that had my name on it. And so it doesn't always happen like it should, but really final review of the manuscript is supposed to occur with all authors. And I think perhaps the hardest criteria to meet, if you think about it theoretically, is this accountability. So everybody needs to be accountable for everything that's in that paper. So you can't say, it's not my fault that the entire article is plagiarized because I'm 3rd author out of 6th. Or you can't say, well, I had no idea that those statistical methods were not credible and were completely fabricated. You really have to be accountable for all of the information in the paper, which I think is that relates a lot to when we're going to talk about with AI or artificial intelligence. And I think it's a really, probably theoretically, maybe one of the hardest criteria to meet if we're going to be authors on manuscripts. All right, so now we'll shift gears a little bit and talk about authorship disputes. So we do know sometimes people get upset. They wanted to be 2nd author, now they're 3rd author. They wanted to be included, they weren't included. So what happens when these things happen? So authorship and order of authors is decided by the researchers. It's an internal decision. You can't go to a journal editor and argue that you should have been on a paper, that you should be, 1st rather than 2nd. You can't have them adjudicate your problems. If these sorts of issues come up, typically it's the institution that needs to investigate and try to resolve these conflicts. Obviously, it can be pretty contentious, and depending on the setting where you work, could be kind of high stakes for you. So it's definitely something that you need to figure out internally, and the earlier the better. You want to figure that out before we get to the stage of the manuscript submission. So I don't know if any of you recognize this person. So this is Rosalind Franklin, and there's a lot of lore around her and Watson and Crick and the discovery of the structure of DNA. There's been lots of talk about whether she was slighted by not being an author or a Nobel Prize winner on this important work that was done at that time. And I mean, it's become like such an important part of our culture that the debate still continues on some level, and we'll talk about that a little bit. So she did this X-ray diffraction with her research assistant, Raymond Gosling, and she was working as a collaborator of Wilkins, who was somebody who actually did share the Nobel Prize. And there was debate about whether this X-ray, which shows this X pattern, was really, really important in Watson and Crick's discovery of the structure of DNA, and whether she was slighted by not receiving the appropriate credit. It's become so ingrained in recent past that there was even a play termed Photograph 51, which is that photograph, starring Nicole Kidman in 2020, and a really cute rap, if you want to watch this online, about how Rosalind Franklin was not given her fair share. A recent article about this controversy continues to try to shed light on it with some historical documents. These authors argue that actually maybe the truth is a little bit more in the middle here. Like maybe she wasn't as fully wronged as we like to think that she was at this point. The controversy is that Watson implies in his book, which is published later, that he immediately discerned the structure of DNA upon seeing her image. The truth is a little bit more nuanced, according to these Nature article authors, saying that having reviewed some historical information, it appears that perhaps the department head and Wilkins, who shared in the Nobel Prize, willingly shared this data, but that Franklin was apparently aware of this and not objecting. The idea is that maybe many iterations of discovery occurred before her data was used merely as confirmation. But she did have very important contributions to the structure of DNA. She differentiated the two forms of DNA, the A part and the B, the crystalline from the paracrystalline. She did measurements showing that DNA was a very large molecule. She determined some symmetry that I probably couldn't explain to you if you wanted to dig deeper into this, but that was important, I suppose, and how DNA could specify proteins. So she had some very important contributions regardless. So I'm telling you this long story to give you some takeaways. So authorship and credit can be a source of conflict that, if you're looking at the Nobel Prize, can be incredibly important in your career. But these issues really can't be resolved, sometimes even historically. We can't really figure out the truth. And so they definitely can't be clearly resolved by journals or journal editors very easily. So the idea would be that you really should discuss these issues early in your collaboration, when you're formulating the project, when you're formulating who will work on the project. And, things can change over the course of a long research project, but I think trying to set out some fair and clear standards and ideas about that early can help avoid some of this conflict later on. It's also important, this has gotten a lot of attention with Rosalind Franklin's case, is a bunch of men who didn't credit a woman, and we do need to think about equity issues when we determine authors and authorship. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. So our former director of the Center for Bioethics, Dr. Jagsy, wrote this article in an illustrious journal in 2006, looking at authorship of women versus men in first and last authored positions in some of the more prestigious journals that are published at this time. So here you can see data showing that we have on the left-hand side, we can see that from 1970 until the current, or not current, but the time that this was published in 2000, I think she went up to 2004, the number of medical students who are women have increased, pretty exponentially, as have the number of women who are first authors and senior authors and professors, but not at the same rate. So she was looking at this data to see how the journals match up. So she looked at these journals that are considered prestigious: New England Journal of Medicine, JAMA, Annals of Internal Medicine, the Annals of Surgery, Obstetrics and Gynecology, and the Journal of Pediatrics. And between 1970 and 2004, the number of first and senior author women did go up substantially in each of these journals. It's important to note, though, that they went up much more impressively in Obstetrics and Gynecology and the Journal of Pediatrics, possibly reflecting that there are more women in those fields that have been than was traditionally the case in the 1970s. So this was one of the important articles looking at this here, and we can see that whereas in obstetrics and gynecology, it went from 6% to 40% first authors who were women. In the Annals of Surgery, which is not as, doesn't have as many women, went only from 2% to 16%. So increases, but not quite as impressive in those areas. Shoot. Oh. All right, so then there was more data. So this article that looked at later data. So that one went up to 2004. This went from 2008 to 2018. All right, so this paper looked at first authors and women last authors in these other journals, not all overlapping, but some similar, and saw that there was the biggest increase in first author women and last author women in obstetrics and gynecology, and then also in cross-specialty journals over this time period. So covering a longer or more recent time span as well. They did notice as well, though, a couple of other things that I wanted to point out, that if women were last authors, they were more likely to have women first authors, and women had a slower transition from first to last author. So whereas men, it took them about 5 years to make that transition from first author position to the senior author position, it took women about 10 years on average versus men. All right, so this paper looked at, in Nature in 2022, looked at surveys of people to see the kinds of research attributions they had experienced, or maybe that they had not experienced, and how they felt about these things and why they had occurred. So this article had some things in here that kind of resonated with me. One of the quotes here I wanted to point out: the necessary level of work required for authorship is often not clear to everyone participating on research teams, and the level of work deemed necessary to receive attribution can vary on the basis of the idiosyncratic personal preferences and a team member's relationship with the principal investigator. Thus, women and other historically marginalized groups must often put in significantly more effort in order for their scientific contributions to be recognized. And I think anybody who's worked in a research lab realizes it's not very uniform how these things work. And you can see in their table here, table 1, that across all groups, faculty, postdoc, graduate student, research staff, undergraduate, that the likelihood of ever receiving attribution is higher for men than women, bigger gaps in different groups, but overall that's true for all of those groups. I thought this was interesting. Power imbalances were also frequently mentioned. For example, publications were used as reward and punishment. The department heads were on everything. So I remember, I won't name names, but when I was working in the research lab, that there was a chairman who insisted on being on every paper that was published in our laboratory because of the support that he had provided our faculty member, which, is probably not one of those criteria for authorship that we discussed. All right, so the survey data asked people how they had participated in these projects. And you can see purple for men and orange for women. And, it's pretty similar. Most of these areas, conceptualization, data curation, formal analysis, all of these things, pretty similar. Maybe men participate a little bit more with software and a couple of these other things. So not substantial discrepancies in the survey data about self-reported involvement in these areas that we consider important for authorship. And some of the reasons for women and men saying that they were left off papers included, some things very reasonable, personal responsibilities or left the lab, some non-research professional things. But interestingly, women also were more likely to report having their contributions underestimated and some discrimination or bias. So I think it's important for us to remember that we need to think about equity so that people who aren't very forceful about claiming credit get the credit that is due to them. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the issue of co-first authorship. So some of you might not be familiar with this phenomenon, but because there are a bunch of labs that tend to collaborate, we can have co-first authors on papers. And one of my colleagues was recently a co-first author, and I asked her how they decided like who should be first and last, because you could do it alphabetically, you could flip a coin, and she was just like, oh, I just let him be the first author. So I don't know. I mean, I feel like maybe we need to have a little bit of thought going into this. So what they did here was they looked at how often, if a man and a woman were co-first authors, how often the man was listed first or the woman was listed first. And in this, they looked both at basic science type journals and then also the more clinical journals such as Annals of Internal Medicine and BMJ and JAMA, and looked to see like were the women and men equally listed first or second, or was there a discrepancy? And it was interesting because the basic science journals seemed to be a little bit more evenly split, and the clinical ones seemed to favor the male co-first author being listed first. And you think, well, I mean, they're co-first authors, like, does it matter? But like still like somebody has that first name and then, et al. And colleagues follows after that name. So it might be reasonable to do something like flip a coin or something like that if you're in this type of situation. The underrepresentation was also examined in this article with JAMA, New England Journal, looking at women authors, men, and then also underrepresented minorities, and again found that there was a discrepancy having more male authors and very few Black and Hispanic authors over several decades. So it is something that we should be aware of and think about when we're trying to give credit to people who work in our laboratories. And then the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors has also thought about these issues, and they promote thinking about including collaborators from your low and middle income countries because that's fair, right? We collaborated with them, but also it provides some context and provides implications for the research that might not otherwise be as evident if we don't have their involvement. So we don't want to be Western focused that we don't include our international collaborators as authors on our papers. This might seem kind of boring, but like who's the corresponding author? So I always just thought, oh yeah, it's the PI on the project because the postdocs come and go and the medical students come and go, but there really are some criteria that you should be able to meet if you want to be the corresponding author on a paper. So you're going to be the primary communicator. So you need to be able to provide all of the author information, like track down authors that have moved away, provide IRB approvals that people may require, and any sort of disclosure information that you can. It's also very important that you just be responsible. You have to be able to respond to editorial queries. You know, you get last minute proofs that you have like 2 days to read and any sort of post publication responses. So maybe you'll have to write a little, rebuttal to somebody's question or letter to an editor that might require your attention. I think acknowledgments don't get enough attention, so you really can give someone credit in acknowledgments, and sometimes that's much more appropriate than giving them authorship. So examples that would be good for acknowledgments, provided some funding, like the department head at my university way back then would have been nice to give him an acknowledgement rather than authorship. Supervision of the research group, like maybe you're the lab manager, but you're not like directly involved with that paper. General administrative support, so your admins who really helped you with different aspects could be acknowledged. I put an admin on a paper one time. Technical writing assistance and proofreading. So a colleague friend of mine told me a story about how his section head like read one of his papers for him when he was a junior attending and insisted on being an author after that, which is incredibly inappropriate. And instead, it would have been nice to acknowledge that person. So some of the examples of acknowledgements could include served as scientific advisors, critically reviewed the study proposal, collected data, provided and cared for study patients, participated in writing or technical editing of the manuscript. Sometimes maybe if you're not a native speaker, you might need somebody to help you just make sure that everything reads correctly. And maybe nowadays that's the job for AI. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And then get approval. It's interesting, but you probably shouldn't acknowledge someone without letting them know that you're going to acknowledge them because they might, for some reason, object. And that would be kind of sad, I guess, if somebody objected, but like maybe they just don't feel comfortable with the paper or some other reason that they would object to being acknowledged. Authorship numbers. So this is kind of fascinating. So we've all seen those papers that have like 5 billion authors on them, and this has been a trend. So in 1981, the highest number of authors in a paper was 118 co-authors. In 2008, which was early in my career, the number had skyrocketed to 3,000 co-authors. And then in 2019, over 5,000. So do you really think all those people are meeting all four of those criteria that we discussed? The other issue with this is that obviously, if you collaborate with all these people, you can't use them for your promotion letters too. So that can be a huge hassle if you're trying to go up for promotion someday. So I think we need to think about this trend, and Nature did start thinking about this trend in 1999 when they began publishing each author's role. So you've probably seen that, if you've been paying attention to a lot of different journals now, make authors say exactly what they were involved in. And that helps with the whole accountability and making sure that people really, qualify as authors, although, it still is kind of subjective. Removal of an author after submission can rarely occur for, various reasons. If you want to do that, it requires an explanation to the journal and then a written statement by all of the authors, including the person who is now being excluded, that they are okay, that that person is not going to be listed as an author anymore on that paper that's already been submitted. All right, so there's also some ethical and compliance issues that arise with manuscript review. So I think all of us are familiar with those requests to review journal articles. It's part of the scientific process. You find peers who can review your work and see if it is appropriate for publication. And I think we've all volunteered doing that at some point. So journal article submission and review. It's very important if you're a reviewer to be confidential about it. You should never tell someone that you reviewed, tell someone else that you reviewed the paper, any sort of details about the study that you reviewed, any sort of critiques that came out of that review, or the status of that, like whether it was rejected or whether it was actually accepted. Reviewers can't use details of the paper for their own benefit or retain any sort of copies of that paper. The identity is not given to the authors, and the comments should not ever be published or disseminated. The peer review process for each journal should be published and transparent as well, so that everyone's aware of how it works. All right, we're just going to take a little detour into a short discussion about collaboration with industry. A lot of people have research projects that might be partially funded by an external source. We had that at my lab, and at UCSF, we had a company that was funding a little bit of our research over there too, as well as the government. It's important because of conflicts of interest that we have to disclose any sort of relationships that we have, whether they're actual or perceived conflicts. The disclosure is required and they need to be complete. I mean, we can have a long discussion, an ethical discussion about whether just admitting your conflict somehow makes it disappear, because obviously that doesn't always happen. But we've come up with a way of disclosing them, and then outside people will often look at them and try to decide if there could be some sort of issue with what you're speaking about or writing about. Conflicts can include your employer. Where are you employed? Who do you consult with? Do you own stock in the company? Even having a spouse that owns stock, honoraria, patents that you might have accrued over your career, and paid expert testimony. The less quantifiable ones are things that I think are harder to sort out. So your personal relationships could be a conflict. You could have a rival and you're being asked to review their paper, or, and that can lead to its own conflict and probably has occurred in a lot of situations. You can have intellectual beliefs that can be a conflict, as well as competitors. So it's an interesting area to try to figure out how do we make sure that all of these aren't influencing our work. So it's not only for authors. So if you're a peer reviewer, obviously, if you have, a conflict with a paper for whatever reason, because you maybe are the rival of the other laboratory, if you're an editor or if you're an editorial board member, you can also have these types of conflicts. Sponsored research. So if you're going to write something with a company, you must have access to all the data. You can't have a situation where they cherry pick data, give it to you, and then you write a manuscript. You must have academic freedom, so they can't say like where you're going to publish it or what's going to be the content of the article, or that's kind of going into this area of this ghostwriting that people talk about. So, ghost authorship is a concept where people aren't really involved with writing, and it's more of you're using your name for the industry's benefit. So, the paper could be written by a company, it could not be reviewed by the authors who are actually listed. You might not have access to all the data that you need to decide if you can vouch for this paper and if you didn't write the conclusions. These are all clues that really this might not be a legitimate type of collaboration for you. All right, plagiarism. So this is a tricky topic, especially nowadays with artificial intelligence. So we all are familiar with this from the old-fashioned kind from grade school, but I liked this excerpts from the Plagiarism Hall of Excuses. Some of them probably really legit, some pretty funny. So it's only background introductory material. It's only a proposal. It's not like it's a publication. The reviewers are smart enough to know. My native language does not have a word for this thing called plagiarism. I didn't do it. My grad student, such and such, such and such, such and such. And that's the problem. We all have to be accountable and vouch for the paper, right? So I told you that's the hardest part of authorship. It's in the public domain, which gets into like some of the things we'll talk about with AI. The pressure of the deadline and the room overheating resulted in my carelessness. It's not plagiarism, it's just bad citation, acid reflux, and then chirping birds. So nowadays, I'll share a little story with you. So a few years back, we were collaborating with a trainee on a chapter, and somebody said, I noticed that it seemed like some of the sections of the chapter, a different chapter, were pulled from another book. And I was like, oh no, like how do I figure this out? Like, because obviously I haven't memorized every book that I've ever written. So nowadays, we're lucky enough to have these types of programs that we can use, and there are some that are sponsored by the university to help us identify blocks of text that, might seem kind of bland if you're just reading it over and proofreading somebody else's work, but can help you identify plagiarism more accurately because, it is pretty easy to write something scientific or technical the same exact way that somebody else did, either intentionally or unintentionally. So I think these tools can be very helpful for nowadays for us. I think this is an interesting thing we could get into in the question and answer session, but how often can you publish the same, like, can you submit the same poster to like three different meetings? Like, some of the pathology meetings require that you say this is the only place you've submitted this work. Others don't necessarily have that clause. So I never really thought I could use the same data at different meetings, but my basic science colleagues tell me that that's pretty common. Obviously, you can take a paper and write about some aspect of your research and then write the expanded version with another sub question that you're answering in a manuscript. So maybe you added on a new angle to this work that you've been doing your whole career. So I think that's pretty common. So I'm curious if people take posters and just show them at multiple meetings, because it was never something that I thought that I was allowed to do. Now we're going to get into artificial intelligence. This area is so rapidly evolving that even the stuff I looked up in 2023 is a little bit outdated, and I had to update it for this talk. So artificial intelligence, for those who aren't familiar, include large language models, chatbots, and image creators. This is a tool that you may have played with. The only time I've used it was I recently tried to write a proposal for a course that I want to design, and it was amazing. Like, it just did an amazing job. It's much more verbose than I am, but anyway, so the question is like in publishing, how much can we use this? How do we give AI the credit that it deserves, I guess. I don't know if it deserves credit, but it needs credit. So back in 2023, when I first started working on this topic, there was this article, ChatGPT listed as author on research papers many scientists disapprove. So nowadays, I think it's pretty standard that we're not going to list ChatGPT as an author. So how do we acknowledge that we used it? So when I did this lit search back then, you can see that in 2023, all these papers are coming up about ChatGPT and research papers. And it's like, I'm sure there's millions more now, even in the last 2 years. So I found this website that I thought was cute called I Love PhD, and it said how to use ChatGPT to write a scientific research paper. So you can use it for anything that you would, that you would do. You can define your research question or hypothesis. It can help you do a literature review, although you should be careful because I guess citations are one of its weaknesses. You can gather and analyze data. I'll show you a little spot where it actually writes code for you. I mean, it's crazy. You can organize your paper. You can modify it, help you with flow, and like if you're not a very good writer, it can help you with grammar and things like that. It can draft your paper and then edit and proofread it for you. So this was an example from a paper in 2023. The person who was feeding the data said, I have a data set consisting of a cohort of 100,000 healthcare workers. Some are vaccinated and some are not. We also have a data on if they were hospitalized. So then ChatGPT says, based on this data set, you can perform statistical analysis to determine if there is a correlation between vaccination status and hospitalization due to COVID-19. It suggests doing proportion of vaccinated individuals who are hospitalized versus unvaccinated individuals who are hospitalized. It suggests chi-square test or logistic regression. And then it says to control for these other variables. So, not too bad, even in 2023. And then here's the example where it says that they have 14 days for a host to mount a response to the vaccine, and then it gives them actually code that it can use to write a program to figure this out, which is, pretty impressive for 2 years ago. Probably now it can rule the world or something like that. And then here's an example of an abstract that it actually created. It looks pretty legit. We're like just kind of looking through. It's got the background and the methods and the results and a conclusion. You could probably even like tell it how many words you want it to be so that you can meet criteria for your, meeting submission or whatever you're working on. So some issues that have been identified, sometimes it just makes up references. So it can be kind of telltale. I guess it has some certain words too that clue people into the fact that it might have been written by AI because it tends to like certain words more than others. And then I think the plagiarism thing is really, really complicated because obviously it pulls all of its information from sources that are available to it, and we don't know which sources it's using. And so it's almost like inherently plagiarism on some level. So figuring that out is tricky, I think, theoretically and practically. And how do we define it nowadays that it's going to be these things that are like pulled from the internet? How do we define plagiarism in the era of AI? So important things if you're going to try using this for your research are that you must confirm the results. You can't just take it at its word. You must assume the responsibility that we discussed. So the reason that AI can't be an author on a paper is it can't be accountable. And that's why now we'll talk about how you would credit AI, but it should not be an author on your paper. You need to ensure that there's no plagiarism with text and images, which, you could use some of those plagiarism programs I mentioned, but it's tricky. Inherently, it might just kind of be plagiarism, in its own theoretical way. And then make sure you check the references because it just pulls some references out of thin air sometimes. And then if you're going to use it, and we'll talk about, you need to look at the journal that you're submitting to, but AI typically should be acknowledged. So it should be in the acknowledgement section or placed in the method section if it has, if it's applicable to one of the methods that you used in your paper. So even hot off the presses from this month, Nature did an article on, is it okay for AI to write science papers? Nature survey shows the split here. And so I'm going to show you some of the data from these 5,000 researchers that they surveyed about whether you should be able to use AI for your papers. Here was the question that was posed to the participants. Dr. Blogs writes a first draft of their research article. Then they use ChatGPT or another tool to help edit the article, such as asking for suggestions about its clarity, its flow, or its tone. They don't disclose that they used AI. What is your view? So pretty split here, like appropriate, a third of the people, only appropriate if disclosed, a third of the people, only appropriate if prompts disclosed, 20% of people, and not appropriate under any circumstances is 10%. So we don't have clear consensus on this amongst researchers. Opinions about using AI to draft different sections of a paper. So they asked people how they felt about that. Blue is it's appropriate. Gray is only appropriate if disclosed, and red is never appropriate. So we can see that people feel a little bit better about making it appropriate for abstracts than they do for like discussion sections, but obviously people are not agreeing on these different aspects of the use of AI in drafting your paper. Experiences with using AI to write papers. So this kind of looks at whether people actually have done this. The dark blue is yes, they've done it, but no disclosure. The light blue is yes, I've done it and I've disclosed it. The yellow is no, I've not done this, would be willing to. And the orange is no, I have not done this and wouldn't do it. So you can see here that we do have people admitting that they did it and did not disclose it. So there's no uniform practice at this point about how people are either acknowledging or disclosing their use of AI in writing their research papers. I pulled this from the science website today. So they have a stance and for all of their journals, and it says, I'll read it to you, the AI-assisted technologies do not meet standard journals criteria for authorship. So again, agreeing with our international committee of journal editors, and therefore may not be listed as authors or co-authors, nor many sources cited in science journal content be authored or co-authored by AI tools. Authors who use AI-assisted technologies should note this in the cover letter and in the acknowledgement section. Detailed information should be provided in the methods section. The full prompt used in the production of the work, as well as AI tool and its version, should be disclosed. Authors are accountable for the accuracy of the work and assuring no plagiarism. They must also ensure that all sources are appropriately cited and should carefully review the work to guard against bias. And reviewers may not use it for generating or writing their reviews. And we'll talk about that. It has a problem with privacy and confidentiality. It's interesting because AI generated images are forbidden. So exceptions could occur in certain types of situations that they would have to discuss with the journal. So in terms of the peer review, I wanted to mention how you can use AI to review papers, but this is worrisome to some and actually forbidden by other journals. The reason is because if you put the paper into like a chatbot, you could violate confidentiality because it then like learns from that paper and has that data stored somewhere, I guess. And it must not be done unless you seek permission and make sure that it's okay. So science just told us, no, you can't do that. So they looked at comparing AI and human peer review. They asked 300 researchers to compare human and large language models reviews of their own papers. And it was interesting because some people actually found that the AI was better than the humans at giving them helpful feedback. But lots of debate here about how helpful the feedback was based on the AI versus the human. All right, so we're almost out of time here, so I'm going to give you guys a little quiz. A researcher provides tissue blocks to another researcher at an outside institution to study the genetics of lymphoma. Should this person be an author on the paper? So, people use different criteria for authorship in different fields. I can say that, sometimes people will give you authorship for providing a picture of something or these sorts of things, but we want to make sure that we meet all the criteria that we discussed. So it really depends. So substantial contribution to data design and possibly conceptualization, but you still need to do these other steps. You still need to draft or provide the critical review that we discussed, read the manuscript, and then be accountable. So do you want to be accountable for this paper that's going out that maybe you had some minimal involvement in? This is kind of not really minimal involvement. This is, providing a lot of the data that's needed for the paper, but you want to make sure that you meet all of these criteria that we discussed. All right. I'm sure you guys all got 100% on that. How should you cite your use of AI if it is used to analyze some data in your paper? So should you make it a middle author? Should you describe the use in the methods section, or should you place in the acknowledgements? So this is B and or C, depends on the journal. So if it applies to the methods, the International Journal of Medical Editors says you should put it in the methods and describe it in the methods section. Otherwise, put it in the acknowledgements. And as is very important for you to remember, it cannot be an author, and for probably many reasons, but mostly because it cannot be accountable. So it cannot vouch for the validity of this paper or its data or its conclusions. All right, so we have one more question. Can you use AI to help you review a paper? I think you're going to remember this because we just covered this one. So not unless you get explicit permission from the journal. It could violate confidentiality, especially if you put it in a public space. And you should probably assume no unless you hear explicitly otherwise about that. All right, so we all want to be really serious professional researchers like Lyle here. He's taking all of this very seriously. So definitely ask me questions and I'll try to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren. We have a couple of questions, I think. All right, I'm just going to go through and then questions. Do you find with co-author or with co-first authors, where the man is listed first, then the woman, that the paper is taken more seriously? Is that?
Oh, that's a good question. We'd have to look into that research to see if nowadays I'm not sure everybody always knows what the author's first names are, so maybe it's not always clear like if they're a man or a woman, but that'd be something to look at research wise, I suppose.
Yeah, I'm trying to think when it's published, if it's like if you know if it's co-first authors or how clear that is to the people reviewing the paper or
Yeah, and that's like I think the co-first authorship is kind of like it's kind of a nice way to try to acknowledge more than one person in an equal way, but like, does it really end up being considered perfectly equal? I'd have to ask my researcher colleagues if they feel like it's an effective strategy too.
I think it could be interpreted differently by different folks. I was just a comment about awareness that some journals editors do have plagiarism software that they might run articles through. I know for the couple of journals that I review for, one of them, actually no, both of them do have some level of review for plagiarism that they do prior to things going out for review.
Yeah, I think that's
Um,
great because I think it's helpful, to identify that early so that you're not stuck in the situation where maybe you didn't do it, you didn't have access to it, and now like you could potentially end up an author on something where you didn't realize there was text that was taken from something else.
and then do you know from on the back end what happens when or if you inform a journal that you use ChatGPT or AI, do they ask for additional information?
I think it's probably safest to put it in the acknowledgments and then see because it looks like science actually makes you say exactly which one you used and like specifically. So I'm think if you look in the instructions to authors part of your journals, they probably have gotten to the point where they're specifying how much information they want about that.
And I've seen like there's not a lot of consistency across platforms for like or journals. There's a range of what they would like.
Yes, I think kind of like the whole like authorship attribute like how figuring out who did what for each paper. I think that varies for each journal, like trying to specify what the authors did to deserve authorship. So that I'm sure AI is like behind it too, that it's taking them a while to figure out how they want to do that. Um, the
Do
other,
you know?
I'm
Oh,
sorry.
sorry. And in your looking and preparing for this, did you see? I've got a question about is one AI sort of version more helpful than others? Um,
Yeah, I'm not sure. And I'm like not super sophisticated about this stuff. So I haven't personally figured out like which chatbot or LLM I think is best because I've used one like one time. And so I definitely don't know which ones people find to be the most helpful.
Right. Well, thank you, Lauren, for your presentation, and thank you for everyone for joining us for Bioethics Grand Rounds. Just as a reminder, next month in June, Bioethics Grand Rounds isn't occurring to allow folks to participate in a presentation given by Dr. Sam Chow, who's going to be speaking about care for patients who are incarcerated. Um, and then we are taking hiatus break from grand rounds during July and August, and we'll be back in September. And in the chat, there is a link for social workers now to complete the CEUs. Thank you, everybody, and see you in September. Bye.
Hi, you guys. Thank you.